It's time for the 1430 Connection on 1430 WNAV and 99.9 FM, spotlighting news, newsmakers, and important community issues. Now, with this week's edition of the 1430 Connection, here is WNAV news anchor Donna Cole.
Welcome to the 1430 Connection. I am Donna Cole. In the studio with me today is Tom Guay, and you might know him best as one of the members of the Eastport Oyster Boys, or you might know him as a docent at the Charles Carroll House here in Annapolis. You might also know him as a performer on the schooner Woodwind. You might know him any number of ways, but welcome, Tom, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Donna. Good to be here.
The reason Tom is here today is to talk about the Peggy Stewart and the burning of the Peggy Stewart, which is something he knows well. It was an event that happened in Annapolis, and we'll get into the history of that. He's written about it. I think he's definitely sang about it.
Yes, you could call it singing.
I've heard it, and it's a great tune. So tell me, let's take me and the audience members back to October 14th, 1774, when it was probably a quiet day out in the Annapolis harbor until what?
Well, it would have been a typical day. I don't know the weather report that day, unfortunately. But anyway, the Peggy Stewart, which was built here in the Chesapeake, Annapolis region.
And named after?
And named after the owner. The owner was Anthony Stewart. The boat was named after his daughter, Peggy Stewart, who, when the boat was launched, she would have been 5 years old, maybe. Anyway, so the boat comes into town and anchors. And what makes it interesting is that Anthony Stewart had sent his boat to England to sell the thing. And his captain, a guy named Captain Jackson, was unable to get the price. So instead, he loads it up with indentured servants as the main cargo. And I believe there are 51 indentured servants on board. Other researchers think it's 53. But anyway, it's a little bit over 50. They were all young men, early 20s. They all had some kind of working skills. That was a main cargo. It was a profitable cargo. And it was a good, steady business to import indentured servants into America. That's how a lot of our early compatriots arrived here as indentured servants, because back in London, it was an incredibly overcrowded city with the super rich living next to the super poor, and unemployment was rampant. You could have been the best tailor, the best shoemaker, the best weaver, the best artisan of any type, and you might work 3 or 4 months a year tops. The rest of the time, you were just unemployed. So
the bottom of the economic spectrum view the New World as their way out.
Yes, as Bill Murray most acutely, awarely said, our ancestors were kicked out of every country in Europe, and which is true. We were all the poor people coming over here. And they came over here for a lot of reasons, but mostly there was dead end back in England. So the Peggy Stewart drops anchor in Annapolis Harbor. Main cargo, all these servants. But unbeknownst to Captain Jackson, a rival Annapolis company secreted some cargo on board, supposedly linens, on the Peggy Stewart back in London, and it was 2,000 pounds of tea. It's a relatively small amount of tea.
Right.
The Peggy Stewart shows up in Annapolis Harbor with tea on board. The owner then pays the tea tax, and that sets Annapolis on fire, because at the time, the colonies had all adopted a non-importation agreement. No tea is coming in until Parliament and the King revoke their tea tax, which is what triggered the Boston Tea Party 7-8 months ahead of time. And so the colonies are all united. Anthony Stewart comes in,
and
realizes this.
We as Americans back then had developed a disdain for anything English at that time, including the king, correct?
They were mostly angry over the tea tax because of this thing that we all learn in school called taxation without representation.
Right.
That was really the issue. It wasn't the amount of the tax. It was the fact that Parliament decided this is a great idea and we're just going to do it, and you colonies are just going to have to live with it. And that's a lot of what's going on in the background. What happens is Anthony Stewart pays the tax. Word gets out immediately, and a mob starts forming. At first it's slow, it's a quiet thing, and then that's Friday night. Over the course of the next 4 or 5 days, the mob gets really agitated. People come from outside the city and really add fuel to the fire. outside agitators. And they decide, they are so furious that first they make Anthony Stewart apologize, and then Anthony Stewart publishes a handbill that explains his side of the story. Nobody wants to believe him, whether it's true or not. They are so angry with him. The tea was actually not even his. He was just transporting it to a rival company here in Annapolis. So imagine that.
But he was probably going to get a nice payday on that from that rival company, so he needed to get it.
He would get transportation charges on, I would assume. He would not make a profit on the resale of that tea, but it was his responsibility to pay the tax. In Anthony's defense, he claims that the reason he paid the tax was that he wanted to make sure that he got his main cargo, 51 indentured servants, off the boat. And there's a reason for that. A couple of years before this, Anthony Stewart had broken yet an earlier embargo against British goods. He brought a ship in called the Good Intent, and it was loaded with 10,000 pounds of banned cargo, all different items. It was under, for you history kids out there, 1765 is the Stamp Act. That's very unpopular. That's replaced by something called the Townsend Acts. And that has a whole bunch of itunes, paints, everything are taxed specially. And that's very unpopular. Anthony Stewart brings in the Good Intent. He's caught, I believe it was down in Galesville area in the roads, West Rivers. I believe that's where it was. He's caught bound down there by the Patriots, and that case is settled by they send the boat back to England unloaded. Defenders of Anthony Stewart would say, you know, Anthony wanted to get the Peggy Stewart cargo off. He wanted to get his servants off because it was a 3-month voyage. Of course, it's miserable. The boat leaks. It wasn't that really well built of a boat. So that's his defense. Legitimately, Anthony Stewart did not know the tea was there originally until the boat shows up. But he pays the tax right away. And so over the next few days, the mob gets really agitated over the idea that Anthony Stewart has broken the colonial embargo on paying tax on tea.
We want to build some suspense here. You know, just like TV.
Okay.
We got to have the music leading up to it.
All right, cut to the villain.
Exactly. We're going to take a short break. This is Donna Cole, 1430 Connection. We will be right back. Welcome back to the 1430 Connection. I'm Donna Cole. In the studio with me today is Tom Guay. We're getting an incredible history lesson on the burning of the Peggy Stewart. It happened, we just had the anniversary of this event. It was the
242nd anniversary of the burning of the Peggy Stewart.
And so we're back in October 14th, 1774. We've learned that a ship has pulled into the Annapolis harbor. On it are indentured servants. That's the main cargo. The other little small part of the cargo is some tea. The owner of the ship has paid the tax. Our new colonists are not very happy about paying this tax because they're being taxed without representation. So take it from the point we just were at, Tom.
So Anthony pays the tax. Word leaks out. A mob of of local politicians, including many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and what was forming is the anti-king party, so to speak. People who are opposed to the tax policies, they're getting more and more angry, and they're fighting the establishment of the day, which would be supporters of the king. They would also be known as Tories. The mob comes into town and gets really upset, and they end up rallying in front of Anthony Stewart's house. They even erect...
Which was where?
It's over on Hanover Street here in Annapolis. It's right against the Navy Academy wall. It's kind of hard to find today.
Okay.
It's privately owned. You can't go in and visit it. And it has been modified over the years, so it doesn't look the same.
Okay.
The Peggy Stewart house, by the way, after the Stewarts sold the house, they sold it to Thomas Stone, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So in my point of view, it should be known as the Thomas Stone House.
Right.
But anyway, it's known as Peggy Stewart House. It's on the National Registry. Anyway, the mob shows up. They're really angry. Anthony Stewart and his rivals, who got him in trouble in a way, are, I forget their name at the moment. I think it's Williams. They had both signed different apologies, and the crowd wouldn't accept it. So they show up on his front door. They erect a gallows. Now, it must have been rather crude, but they erect a gallows. I think it was symbolic. But they were threatening to hang Anthony Stewart on his front doorstep unless he burnt the boat and the tea. Now, the political elite in Annapolis was totally satisfied with just burning the tea. They weren't after the boat burning, but it was the outside crew who came in and demanded more retribution.
The outside agitators.
Yes. A fellow named Matthias Hammond, who built a rather palatial state here in Annapolis, was one of the ringleaders. And then the man who claims to have erected the gallows is a fellow named Dr. Warfield. And there's a beautiful little story about him on his family's website. You can find it on the internet. He claims to have been a hero of the Patriot cause, threatening to hang Anthony Stewart. So what happens is the next day, Anthony capitulates, and he, on Wednesday the 19th of October, he rows out to his boat, runs it aground on Windmill Point, which is now under the Navy Academy.
Now the indentured servants have been taken off.
They've been taken off.
Okay.
Anthony rows his boat ashore, and they burn it down to the waterline. And then after that, Anthony Stewart is a persona non grata here in Annapolis. He has to leave town right away, and he really never comes back. And he, like many Tories and Loyalists during the American Revolution, some of his property is confiscated. Other Loyalists are confiscated. They're treated badly by the victorious American colonies. Anthony then goes to New York. He gets involved with helping forming a loyalist regiment and helping fight for the king out of New York City. I don't believe he actually got in military uniform and fought. And then he ends up, after the war or sometime, he ends up in Nova Scotia, reestablishing himself as a merchant trader and becoming successful once again. He does retrieve the rest of his family. The indentured servants, everybody knew that they were on board. And so the committee in Annapolis, the special committee of agitators, the Patriot cause, they assign a crew to observe Anthony Stewart's removal of the indentured servants, so to make sure that Anthony doesn't also remove the tea. So the locals were like, yeah, let's get the human beings off the boat. Let's just worry about the cargo problem. What happens to the indentured servants after that? Presumably they're sold, because Anthony's not going to let this get away. Even though Anthony's out of town, Anthony is business partners with his wife's father. He married Jane Dick. It was James Dick who was the Dick Stewart combination that formed the trading party in Annapolis. They were the merchants. They were both involved in that incident in 1771 with the good intent.
Right.
James Dick was not as loyal to the king as Anthony Stewart was. James Dick was able to stay in America. I'm not sure that I haven't followed his story after the event. King George does give compensation to Anthony Stewart for the loss of his boat after the war.
Taking care of one of his own.
Taking care of one of his own. Now, one of the reasons I submit that one of the reasons the Annapolitans got so excised over Anthony Stewart is that he was a known loyalist. And here you have the whole populace of Annapolis, at least the political elite core. They are all rallying around what we now know as the Patriot cause.
Right.
Anthony was snubbing his nose at the Patriot cause. So they were political
when was
enemies.
The Boston Tea Party?
That was in December of 1772. Was it?
So still fresh.
73.
Still kind of fresh in the minds of all these people.
The Boston Tea Party was absolutely fresh in everybody's mind, because right after the Boston Tea Party, which everybody knew about, and most of the colonial patriot cause were going, yeah, they were cheering them on, the King of England then closes Boston Harbor.
Right.
By closing Boston Harbor, that was the last straw that helped unite all the colonies against taxes and the king.
So, the thoughts maybe, could he do that to the Annapolis harbor? The thoughts are, who knows what was in the minds of these. We're going to take another short break, but let's come back to thinking back and deciding what was in the thoughts of these people. This is Donna Cole on the 1430 Connection. We will be right back. Welcome back to the 1430 Connection. I'm Donna Cole. In the studio with me today is Tom Guay. He's telling us a fascinating tale, true story, the burning of the Peggy Stewart, a ship that was brought into Annapolis shortly after the Boston Tea Party. It too had tea on board. I don't know why it's not better known to us that live in Annapolis or anybody outside of Annapolis. It is our Annapolis Tea Party. Boston Tea Party had already happened. Indentured servants were on this boat. That was the main cargo, but there was also tea. And King George was trying to tax this tea. Of course, the colonists were not having any of it. So here we are discussing this anniversary of this burning of the Peggy Stewart. So what was in the minds of these colonists? They didn't want any part of this tax. They didn't want any part of this ship. Burn it down. They said, get the indentured servants off. The indentured servants got that off. Were they thinking that the king maybe was going to close down the harbor to everybody, and we had to get our boats out, we had to get our stuff brought in?
It is actually a good question. There was a threat that the king could close Annapolis Harbor because he had just closed Boston Harbor. But curiously enough, the king ignored the Peggy Stewart incident and the big political incident. It was only after the fact and after the war that the king, through Parliament, gave Anthony Stewart some compensation for the loss of his boat. It is an odd curiosity that nothing happened to Annapolis. And by the way, Annapolis was not the only city around here to have a Boston Tea Party after the Boston Tea Party.
Right.
There was a famous one up there in Chestertown where they unloaded the tea, much like what they did in Boston. And there are other reports of other ships. I believe there was 1 or 2 burnings or other reports where they attacked ships. I'm fuzzy on those other stories because I was just focused on the Peggy Stewart.
And let's talk about that for a minute. So who is Tom Guay? And why do you know all this? You were I'm
a history geek from way back.
Okay.
I mean, I loved history in grade school even, and then I was a history major in college. And then at the last year, I was looking in the newspapers for ideas on where to get a job, and I looked under H for historians, and I didn't see anything. So I made a logical conclusion that historian's not a great job for, it's not going to be easy to find a job. So I did the next best thing. I thought, I'll be a radio DJ.
Perfect.
Yeah,
and we like that here.
Anyway, I stumbled into being a journalist instead, and
yeah, we also like that.
Yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed it because I was around D.C., studied all kinds of. I just like being around history, and so I've always read books. I studied this. The Peggy Stewart. There are a lot of people who have been through these pages before me. I want to mention Glenn Campbell over the Historic Annapolis Foundation.
We have on every week.
Glenn very kindly allowed me to use this picture that showed up in the newspaper, and I love this picture. It's The Burning of the Peggy Stewart by Jack Manley Rose.
It's great. And speaking of which, by the way, if you want to know what he's referring to, Tom recently wrote an article for the Capitol about the burning of the Peggy Stewart. So Google it. You'll find it. It's a lovely article about everything that we've discussed.
What I love about the picture, folks, if you go online and find it, is that I think it represents the situation as it was. You have the boat burning out in the harbor, and you have a crowd of citizens on the shore watching and sort of cheering it on. It's totally different take on the burning of the Peggy Stewart from the big picture that's hanging in the State House. The State House one sort of gives Anthony sort of a heroic, I don't like that vision. That's not my version of events. The picture we're talking about used to be in Carville Hall, and it was salvaged out of the one of the murals from Carville Hall before they turned Carville Hall back into the Peggy House. And so the Historic Annapolis people still have this mural. It's in bad shape, but it's a beautiful shot.
In addition to telling this tale in the Capitol, telling it to us now, you've also written a song about it.
Yes.
And people can see the video to that where...
If you go to the Capitol, look on October 14th issue, they have a link to the video that we produced.
Perfect. And we as the Eastport Oyster Boys.
It was the Eastport Oyster Boys and friends. We had a lot of fun. There's a long story behind why it got written. I thought it would be fun to write a story. And so this song is written from the mob's point of view. And of course, if it's the mob running around the streets of Annapolis, what's it going to be called? Let her burn, burn, burn. I mean, it just makes absolute sense.
Right.
Now, for the people in Annapolis who would like to build a replica of the Peggy Stewart, and there are people who think that would be a nice idea, and it would be a grand idea. We would have our own wooden ship to represent Annapolis. It'd be a nice tourist attraction, and we could. Baltimore has
really
one,
cool.
Chester, Wilmington.
Absolutely.
Everybody, other cities have their ships. Building the Peggy Stewart would be neat. Unfortunately, for that cause, my song is about burning it. But I've written another song about the Peggy Stewart. The flip side of this hit single is a tune written from the perspective of a shipwright who is in Eastport, across the harbor, and he's watching this sad event. He's really upset, and his song is a lament, so the song is called Abandoned by Her Man.
So I'm guessing you have this dream of Annapolis building a Peggy Stewart replica.
Wouldn't it be grand? But that idea is there's not a lot of traction under it right now.
Tom, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
If you want more information about Tom, actually you can visit him as he's leading tours as a docent, again for the...
Oh, the Charles Carroll House, yes. During all summer months, Charles Carroll's house is open on Saturday and Sunday for free tours from 12 to 4. And our last weekend is coming up, so come out this weekend, and that might be it, this coming weekend. And we're closed for the winter months, and then we reopen in mid to late May.
Okay, there you go. Thanks again for joining me here.
Sure, thank you.
This is Donna Cole. This has been the 1430 Connection. I'll see you next week.